Part 1. The Nail in the Door Frame. Black Hills, Dakota Territory. November 4th, 1887. The man digging through the snow was enormous. 6 feet 3 inches of muscle built not in any gymnasium, but across 3 decades of swinging axes, hauling timber and wrestling stone into permanent shapes. His name was Ezra Dunmore, and he was the finest builder in the Black Hills. And right now, he was on his knees in the dark, clawing through 5 feet of packed snow with his bare hands, because the shovel had become useless 20 minutes ago. The blizzard had been screaming for 2 days straight. The temperature had dropped to 40 below zero, and the wind drove that cold through everything. Through wool, through leather, through bone. Through the particular kind of pride that a man builds over a lifetime of being right. Ezra's beard had frozen into a single solid mass against his chest. His fingers, even inside 2 pairs of gloves, had stopped sending signals an hour ago. He did not care. He kept digging. He was digging at the base of a hillside, searching for a door, a small wooden door that led into the earth, into a hole where a woman had buried herself 2 months ago. A woman the entire town of Prospect had quietly written off as dead. A woman he himself had called insane to her face in front of witnesses with the full confidence of a man who had never in 30 years been wrong about anything made of wood and stone. He was not digging to save her. He was digging to perform a final duty, to recover a body, to give the mad Welsh widow a burial that the frozen ground would make nearly impossible, and that he owed her because he had mocked her, warned her, and then walked away. His shovel struck wood. He cleared the snow from the top of the door with his forearms and wrenched the handle with both frozen hands. The door swung open. Ezra Dunmore braced himself for what he knew was coming. The smell of a closed space. The stillness of a room where nothing had moved in a long time. The terrible cold of a tomb. Instead, a wave of warm, dry air washed over his face. Ezra stopped. The shovel slipped from his fingers and fell soundlessly into the snow beside him. He knelt at the top of those 3 short steps, mouth open, the warmth flowing over his ice-crusted skin, like a hand pressed gently against his cheek. That was impossible. He stood there in the howling dark, and the warmth kept coming steady and clean and inexplicable, rising from the earth, like something the ground had been quietly saving for exactly this moment. 2 months earlier, he had told her she was going to die. He was going to have to think very carefully about what that meant. November 4th, 1887. 9 weeks before the blizzard. The sky that morning was the color of old pewter, and the air carried the sharp bite of pine resin and the iron promise of a winter that intended to show no mercy to anyone it found unprepared. Ezra Dunmore stood on the porch of his latest creation, running his palm along the doorframe, with the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman reviewing his own best work. The house belonged to the Mercer family, and Ezra believed it was the finest log structure he had ever built. White oak walls 8 inches thick, dovetail joints so tight you could not slip a playing card between them, a stone hearth massive enough to anchor a fire that could roar through the coldest night Dakota could manufacture. His apprentice, Caleb Marsh, was on his knees beside the porch steps, shaping a wooden peg with a draw knife. Caleb was 19 years old, lean and watchful, with the quick hands of someone who had paid close attention to everything and the quiet eyes of someone who had not yet decided what to do with what he had learned. "Feel that wall," Ezra said. He rapped his knuckles against the oak. The sound came back dense and permanent. The sound of something that would still be standing when everyone alive that morning was dust. 8 inches of white oak. Wind cannot get through it. Cold cannot get through it. That is how a man survives winter out here. You build the wall thick enough that the world outside cannot touch what is inside. Caleb looked up from his work. His eyes moved to the massive stone chimney, rising from the roof-line smoke already curling from it in a gray column that climbed fast and straight into the still air. Then why was the Harrison place so cold last winter? He asked. His walls were thicker than the Peterson place, and the Petersons were fine. Ezra frowned. It was a good question. The kind that annoyed him because he did not have a clean answer for it. And he was a man who had built his life on clean answers. Harrison didn't manage his fire properly, he said. Burned green wood half the season. That's not the fault of the house. Caleb nodded slowly, but his eyes stayed on the chimney a beat too long. Ezra caught the look and misread it. She draws well, doesn't she? Good draft. That's what keeps a house clean and warm. A strong upward pull. A plank slipped from the stack beside Caleb and clattered against the frozen ground. Ezra flinched as though a rifle had discharged 3 feet from his ear. His whole body went rigid, and his hand shot out and gripped the porch railing with a force that whitened his knuckles. The reaction was wildly out of proportion to a falling plank. Caleb stared. Ezra released the railing slowly. When he spoke again, his voice had the careful flatness of a man navigating around something he had not fully looked at in many years. In '73, I built my first house, Nebraska. I was 20 years younger and twice as stupid. I used green cottonwood because it was cheap. The joints were loose. The roof was pinned, not pegged. He paused. A storm came through in January. Not even a bad one by Dakota standards. It tore the roof clean off like pulling a page from a book. My wife and I spent the night in a root cellar with nothing but a horse blanket. She never fully trusted a roof again. Not for years. He looked at the Mercer house, at the thick walls, and the heavy beams, and the enormous chimney, at the permanence of it, at the proof. I swore after that night that I would never build anything weak again. Every problem I have ever seen in 30 years comes down to the same thing. Not strong enough, not thick enough, not heavy enough. You build it right, you build it solid, and the winter cannot touch you. He picked up the fallen plank and set it back on the stack with deliberate care. Remember that. Caleb watched his master walk the porch line, pressing his thumb into the chinking between logs, testing each joint. There was something almost devotional about the way the older man inspected his work. Every tight joint was a small personal victory. Every gap found was a personal failing. But the question did not leave Caleb. It settled into the back of his mind the way a splinter settles into a fingertip. Too small to see clearly. Too sharp to ignore. If the walls were thick enough, why was Harrison cold? He did not ask again. Not that day. The man named Calhoun arrived at the Whitfield cabin on horseback just before noon. He was the kind of man who existed in every frontier town, whether anyone wanted him there or not. Not cruel by nature, merely efficient. The human instrument of processes that did not require cruelty to wound. He rode a gray horse, wore a dark coat, and carried the flat expression of someone who had learned to perform unpleasant duties without allowing them to become personal inconveniences. Clara Whitfield watched him come from the window. She had known this moment was coming for 6 weeks. The knowing had not made it easier. There are things a human being can prepare for rationally and still be completely unprepared for when they arrive. She was sitting on the bare wooden floor of the cabin, with Griffith's mining journal open on her lap. She was not reading it. She was holding it the way you hold the hand of someone who is no longer there. Not for the information inside, for the proximity, The journal was the heaviest thing she owned, not because of its paper and leather, but because every page was a day Griffith had still been alive. His handwriting changed across the months. She could track his dying through the pressure of his pen. The bold, confident script of a healthy man in the early pages becoming smaller and more careful. As the months turned, becoming the cramped, deliberate letters of someone who was spending each word, as though he had a fixed number remaining and needed to make them count. She closed the journal when she heard Calhoun's horse on the frozen ground. She stood. She moved to the window. She watched him dismount without greeting her, walk to the front door of the cabin, and produce from his coat a sheet of heavy paper, a hammer and a single iron nail. He positioned the nail against the doorframe with a professional eye, against the wood that Griffith had felled himself, milled himself, fitted himself in the autumn of 1884, when they had come west from the coal valleys of Wales with a trunk of books, and the conviction that a man who understood the earth could find his place in any new country that still had earth worth understanding. Griffith had carved the date of their arrival into this frame with a penknife on their first night. November 12th, 1884. He had pressed Clara's hand against the carving in the dark and said, "Now it knows we're here." Calhoun drove the nail home with 3 efficient strikes. The point split the carved number 4 directly in half. He turned from the door without meeting Clara's eyes. "The bank will hold the property for 30 days, Mrs. Whitfield. After that," he gestured east in a way that meant nothing specific, and therefore meant everything terrible. "It would be best to make arrangements." He mounted his horse and rode back toward town without looking back. Clara stood alone on the frozen ground. At her feet was a wooden crate containing everything she had left, a cast-iron skillet that had been her mother's in Wales, brought across the ocean in a trunk that still smelled faintly of coal smoke, a wool blanket, a worn copy of Seneca that Griffith had read until the binding had softened to the texture of skin, and the journal. Always the journal. She did not move for a long time. She stood in the November wind and conducted a private inventory of her remaining assets, with the thoroughness of a woman who had decided that an honest accounting was the only respectful response to the situation. No family in this country. No money for a train fare back to a Wales that no longer held anything she recognized. No trade that the frontier valued. No claim to anything except the contents of the crate at her feet, and the knowledge that a man who had loved her had spent years filling a book with ideas that no one else in the Black Hills could read. The people of Prospect were not cruel. They were simply stretched thin, as frontier people always are, each family fighting its own private battle against the coming cold, its own private ledger of debts and obligations, taking in a penniless Welsh widow with nothing to offer but quiet grief was not a calculation anyone could afford to make. She understood that. She did not blame them for it. What she found harder to forgive was the particular quality of their pity, the way it came wrapped in certainty, the absolute confidence with which the people of Prospect had already decided what her story was, what it meant, and how it would end. She picked up her crate and began to walk toward town, not because she had any destination, but because movement has always been the first and most human response to an unbearable stillness. Ezra Dunmore was heading home from the Mercer job site when he passed the Whitfield cabin. He slowed his horse automatically when he saw her standing there, the crate at her feet, the foreclosure notice nailed to the door, its edge lifting and dropping in the wind with a sound like a slow hand clapping. Her face turned toward him with no particular expression, as though she had already decided not to ask for anything from anyone on this road. He had known Griffith Whitfield, respected him in the limited way that a practical man respects a thinker who does not quite understand the full cost of thinking. Griffith was a decent man and a hard worker. But he had also been, in Ezra's private estimation, the kind of man who put ideas ahead of preparation. A miner who spent his spare hours wandering the hills with a notebook, sketching rock formations, scribbling theories about air movement, and heat transfer things that did not put food on a table or wood in a pile, or a sound roof between his family and the winter sky. And now, here was the result. Ezra felt the complicated knot of it in his chest. The sympathy was real. So was the grim and uncharitable relief. This was what happened when a man invested in ideas instead of timber, when he trusted theories instead of doing what was necessary, when he was not solid enough, not practical enough, not prepared. He tipped his hat. It was the frontier acknowledgement. The gesture that said, "I see you. I recognize your humanity, and I am going to continue riding." It carried no promise, no offer, no obligation. Clara Whitfield watched him ride away. She picked up her crate and walked toward town. The Reverend Aldous Vane was waiting for her at the edge of Prospect's main street, where the clapboard buildings gave way to the white steeple of the Presbyterian church. He was a tall, thin man possessed of the particular authority that comes from serving as the sole official intermediary between a small community and its God. He had a kind face and calculating eyes, and he had been waiting for this moment since he heard about the foreclosure, because a minister who does not show up at the moment of a community member's greatest need has failed at the single most visible part of his job. "Mrs. Whitfield." His voice was warm, pitched with practiced compassion. "I heard what happened this morning. I'm sorry." Clara shifted the crate in her arms. "Thank you, Reverend. The church has a small room in the back. It isn't much, but it's warm and dry, and you're welcome to it." He paused. The pause was where the conditions lived. In return, perhaps you could help with the laundry and the cooking for the parish. A fair arrangement, a place in the community, a purpose. Clara understood the architecture of his offer, as clearly as Ezra Dunmore understood the architecture of a log cabin. She had grown up poor enough in Wales to recognize the specific geometry of charity that is designed to be permanent. The debt that cannot be repaid because it is not meant to be repaid. The shelter that becomes a cage so gradually that the person inside it does not notice the bars until they have already forgotten how to walk in open air. She would eat at his table, sleep under his roof, owe him everything she had. And what she had left at this particular moment in her life was exactly one thing: the freedom to fail on her own terms. "That's kind of you, Reverend," she said, "but I can't accept." Vane's expression shifted. A small tightening around the eyes, a slight stiffening at the jaw. He was not accustomed to refusal. In a town the size of Prospect, a public refusal of the minister's charity was not merely an act of independence. It was a declaration of a particular kind of stubbornness that the community would remember and judge accordingly. "Pride is the most expensive sin in winter, Mrs. Whitfield." Clara looked at him steadily. "I'm not proud, Reverend. I simply don't wish to owe anyone else anything." She stepped around him and kept walking. Two members of Vane's congregation, who had been standing on the church steps, heard everything. By supper time, the story would be in every kitchen in Prospect. By morning, it would have transformed, as stories do when they pass through enough mouths, from a woman refusing charity into a woman refusing reason. Vane stood in the cold and watched her go, and he filed the moment away with the careful precision of a man who understood that a public refusal was a debt of a different kind, one that he would be patient about collecting. Dorothea Voss found her before she reached the edge of town. Dorothea was 55 years old, built close to the ground with a face that had been weathered by grief into something resembling carved driftwood. Her husband, a miner named Ernst Voss, had died of the same black lung disease that had killed Griffith Whitfield 3 years before Clara arrived in Dakota. She understood the specific texture of the loneliness that followed, the way a house sounds different when the person who gave it weight is gone, the way you keep finding their handwriting in places and having to sit down. She did not offer Clara sympathy. She did not offer a room. She pressed a small canvas sack into Clara's free hand without ceremony or explanation. Flour, lard, matches. Clara looked at the sack, then at the woman who had given it to her. Every other person in Prospect had either pitied her, dismissed her, or attempted to pull her back into a system that would swallow her whole. Dorothea was doing none of those things. She was giving Clara fuel for whatever road came next, without attaching any conditions to it, without needing to know the destination, without needing to be thanked or credited or consulted. "My husband died underground too," Dorothea said. Her voice was low and matter-of-fact, the voice of someone who had already done all the crying available for a given subject and was now simply reporting. "I know what it feels like when the world looks at you like something used up. But I'm too old to climb hills anymore." She glanced toward the pine-covered rise to the west of town. "You're not." Clara felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, not exactly. Something smaller and more solid than hope. The knowledge that one person, just one, had looked at her situation and seen not a problem to be managed, but a person to be trusted. "Thank you, Dot. Don't thank me. Just don't die." Clara nodded once. She hoisted her crate in the canvas sack and turned toward the tree line at the western edge of a town, and she began to climb. She had been following a memory. A summer afternoon in 1885, when Griffith was healthy enough to pretend he was healthy. He had taken her up through these same pines, moving ahead of her on the trail, with the rolling, easy gait of a man who had been underground so long that open sky still felt like a gift. He had stopped at a flat outcropping of gray stone that caught the afternoon sun and placed his palm flat against it. "Feel this," he said. She pressed her hand next to his. The stone was warm. Not from the surface, but from deep within, as though the rock had been baking slowly for hours and was releasing what it had gathered into everything that touched it. Stone has a longer memory than people Mara. He sometimes called her that, an old Welsh diminutive. It remembers summer long after we've forgotten. He coughed then, a small sound, the kind you wave away with an irritated hand, thinking nothing of it. She thought nothing of it. She knew now that it was the first syllable of a sentence that would take 2 years to complete. She followed the memory of that afternoon up through the darkening pines. The first snow came small and hard, more like grains of salt than anything romantic. Her landmarks appeared one by one out of the dimming light. A lightning-scarred pine that leaned at an angle. A granite boulder split cleanly in two by a century of freezing and thawing. She recognized each one with a small shock of relief, as though the landscape itself was confirming that the afternoon with Griffith had been real, and not something her grief had manufactured. The crate grew heavier with every 100 feet of elevation. The cast-iron skillet alone weighed 8 pounds, and the wooden corners dug into her forearms until she could feel the bruises forming. She shifted the weight from one hip to the other, then to her shoulder, then back to her arms, each position offering a slightly different flavor of pain. She stopped twice and set the crate down and stood with her hands on her knees, her lungs burning from the cold and the altitude. The second time she stopped, she considered leaving the skillet behind. It was dead weight. It served no immediate purpose, but it had been her mother's before it was hers. Carried from Merthyr Tydfil, in a trunk that had crossed the Atlantic in a ship's hold, and then crossed half a continent in a wagon bed. It was the heaviest proof she possessed that a life had been lived before hers, that the line of women she came from had always found ways to cook something from very little in very difficult places. Some things are worth carrying, not because they are useful, but because they are the last proof that a life was lived. She picked up the crate and kept climbing. She found the cellar just as the last light bled out of the sky. It was a dark arch of crumbling fieldstone, almost completely hidden by overgrown hawthorn and wild raspberry canes that had turned the color of old rust in the November cold. A root cellar from a homestead, claimed that had been abandoned decades earlier by a family that had found the Black Hills winters more than they had bargained for. Griffith had shown it to her that summer afternoon, calling it a geological accident, made useful a natural cold vault dug into the permanent stability of the hillside. She pushed through the thorns. The scratches on her hands registered somewhere distant. She ducked through the low entrance. The cellar was small, no larger than a modest bedroom. Earthen walls, a floor of packed dirt. It smelled of deep soil and the particular stillness of a space that has not been disturbed in a very long time. A place holding its breath. The cold inside was different from the cold outside. Outside, the cold was aggressive. It came at you with intent. It found every gap in your clothing, every inch of exposed skin, every moment of stillness. Inside the cellar, the cold was passive. It was the absence of warmth, rather than the presence of something hostile. And that distinction, small as it was, felt like the first rung of a ladder out of a very dark hole. She explored by touch. The walls were rough fieldstone to waist height, then raw earth above packed hard by decades of settling. The ceiling was low enough to require ducking in certain spots where the hillside pressed down. In the far corner, she found a wooden shelf still bolted to the wall, its boards warped and gray but solid. Beneath it, half buried in dirt, a rusted tin can and a broken ceramic crock that might once have held butter or cream. She cleared the shelf and arranged her possessions on it with the care of someone furnishing an important room. The skillet on the left, Seneca and the journal in the center wrapped in the single wool blanket to keep them off the damp. The provisions from Dorothea in the tin can to keep them off the ground. It took less than a minute. There was nothing else to arrange. She sat in the corner of her earthen room, wrapped in the blanket, the skillet beside her, as a useless weapon against imagined predators, and waited for her eyes to adjust to a darkness that did not adjust to anything. When the last edge of sky outside the entrance went dark, the black inside became total. She could not see her own hand. She could hear the wind above her, a high, searching sound that rose and fell like something alive trying to find a way in. She lay in the darkness and thought about Griffith, not about his death, which she had replayed until it had become almost abstract, but about the specific way he used to fall asleep, on his back with one arm behind his head, talking about whatever he had been reading or something he had observed in the mine that day, his voice slowing and thickening until it trailed off mid-sentence. She would lie beside him and listen to his breathing deepen and feel the warmth of him through the quilt, and know with a certainty that required no examination that she was safe. That particular warmth, the warmth of another person, was something no stove or flue or ingenious design could replicate. It was gone, and the knowing of that was the coldest thing in the cellar. She slept. She woke before dawn, stiff and aching, her breath visible in the gray light filtering through the entrance. But she was alive. In November in the Black Hills, that was not a small thing. She reached for the journal. She opened it not to the early pages with their confident diagrams and bold annotations, but to the later sections where Griffith's handwriting had grown smaller, as his lungs had grown weaker. She found the pages she had been looking for. The mine ventilation diagrams, the sketches of horizontal airflow systems, the notes on the constant temperature of deep earth, steady at 55 degrees, regardless of what the season was doing on the surface above. And then she found the sketch, a strange convoluted flue that ran horizontally underground before rising in a vertical pipe to vent at the surface, designed for warming a mine entrance in winter. The principle written beneath it in Griffith's careful hand. The smoke travels through the channel. The stone absorbs the heat. The earth around the stone absorbs the heat from the stone, and the whole mass becomes a slow-release furnace that gives back warmth long after the fire that charged it has gone cold. The Welsh phrase he had underlined twice, Mair Mog Taluhend. The smoke must pay its rent. And then she found the receipt. It was folded small and taped to the page with a strip of dried paste. She unfolded it carefully. A purchase order from a supply house dated August 3rd, 1886. Stone pipe fittings, a small sheet iron stove, clay for mortar. She read the date again. August 3rd, 1886. She sat very still. Griffith had begun coughing blood on August 17th, 1886. She remembered the date the way you remember the dates of things that changed the shape of everything. He had been out by the creek looking at rock formations with his notebook, and he had come inside and sat down at the table and put the notebook down very carefully, as though it had become suddenly fragile. And she had seen the stain on his handkerchief, and had understood without being told what the next 2 years of her life were going to cost. August 17th, 14 days after the receipt. He had known something was wrong before the blood. He had felt it the way a man who has spent 20 years underground learns to feel changes in the air before instruments can measure them. And in the 2 weeks between that feeling and the confirmation, he had designed this system, ordered the materials to build it, and begun planning for a future in which he would not be present. He had not left her nothing. He had left her everything he could. The receipt was not just a piece of paper. It was a message. It was Griffith saying, "I thought of you. I thought of this. I tried to get it ready. I'm sorry I didn't have more time." Clara folded the receipt and put it inside her coat next to her chest, and held it there with one hand for a long moment. Then she closed the journal. Then she stood up. She walked back to town in 1 hour. She did not go to the church. She did not go to any of the houses where sympathetic faces might offer her a meal and a quiet suggestion about what God must have intended by all of this. She went directly to Orville Steck's general store on the main street of Prospect, pushed open the door, and set her crate on the floor beside the counter. Steck was a compact man in his 50s with a merchant's eye for the precise difference between what something cost and what someone would pay for it. He had lived in the Black Hills long enough to have seen many kinds of desperation walk through his door, and he had developed the ability to assess a person's situation and their remaining resources simultaneously without making it obvious that he was doing both. He looked at Clara Whitfield, at her dirt-streaked coat and the scratches on her hands from the hawthorn bushes, at the single crate on the floor. Then he waited. Clara reached into her coat and removed her wedding ring. She set it on the counter between them. The ring was simple gold, worn thin at the bottom where it had pressed against things for 15 years. Against bread dough and soil and the leather covers of notebooks and the handles of tools and the calloused hands of a man who had loved her more carefully and thoroughly than she had sometimes known how to receive. She had told herself many times in the past month that she would never remove it. Swearing she had discovered is a luxury that belongs to people who still have options. "I need a stove," she said, "small with a good damper, 20 feet of stovepipe, a shovel, a pickaxe, and 10 pounds of clay." Steck picked up the ring and examined it without expression. He glanced at her face. He looked at the scratches on her hands. Then he made a calculation. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, setting the ring back on the counter, A stove won't do you much good in a dirt hole. The smoke has nowhere to go. You'll gas yourself before the cold gets a chance. 3 customers were browsing the dry goods shelves at the back of the store. They were not visibly paying attention. They were absolutely paying attention. Clara looked at Steck. The smoke will go where I tell it to go. The 3 customers in the back of the store heard every word. By that evening, the story had traveled to every household in Prospect. In approximately the form it was told, the crazy Welsh widow had traded her wedding ring for a stove and a pickaxe and announced she was going to put a fire in a dirt hole in the hillside and tell the smoke where to go. By morning, the story had collected the particular momentum that small-town stories collect when they touch something people are already afraid of. The fear of making the wrong choice. The fear of dying alone. The fear of being wrong about what is survivable. The fear which ran beneath all the others of a woman who seemed completely unafraid of any of it. Steck shrugged and gathered her supplies. Business was business. Clara picked up the stove with both arms and felt its 60 pounds settle against her ribs, against the place on her chest where she had held the receipt an hour before. She stepped back into the November morning. The stove was not designed to be carried on a human back. It was not designed to be carried by a single person at all. And it was certainly not designed to be transported up a hillside by a woman who had eaten nothing since the previous evening, except a handful of dried corn, and who had slept for the first time on frozen dirt. But it was her stove, bought with the last thing she had valued enough to protect for 15 years. And she was going to carry it up that hill, if it was the last physical act she performed on this earth. The stovepipe sections tied together with a length of rope clanged against each other, with every step a metallic percussion that announced her progress to every creature within half a mile. She stopped 4 times on the ascent. Each time she set the stove down on the hillside and straightened her spine and looked at the sky to judge the remaining light, and then picked it up again. The 4th time she stopped, she sat on a fallen pine and set the stove in the snow beside her. She looked at her left hand. The finger that had worn the ring for 15 years was white and bare where the band had been, a strip of skin that had not seen full light in a decade and a half. She curled her fingers into a fist and pressed it against her stomach, and sat there for a full minute, not crying, not thinking, simply allowing herself to feel the precise weight of what she had traded and what she was carrying. Then she stood up. She swung the stove onto her shoulders. She kept climbing. Caleb Marsh was hauling a load of split timber on a mule-drawn sled back from the Mercer property that afternoon when he heard it. The rhythmic ringing of a pickaxe striking frozen ground. He left the sled on the trail and moved through the tree line toward the sound staying behind the pines without quite deciding to conceal himself. He crouched behind a wide spruce and looked through the branches. Clara Whitfield was standing in a trench. She was covered in mud and sweat despite the cold. Her hair had come loose from its pins and hung in dark strands around a face that was thinner than the face he had seen walking through Prospect. She was laying flat stones into the bottom of the trench one at a time, fitting each one against its neighbor, testing the fit, adjusting, pressing it into the clay beneath with her heel. Caleb watched for 10 minutes without moving. He had spent 2 years learning to build things from Ezra Dunmore. He understood craftsmanship. He understood the difference between work done with intention and work done without it. He had watched Ezra press his thumb into the chinking between logs, and he had learned to do the same thing, to feel for the quality of the fit, to trust the information in his hands. What he was watching now was not the digging of a desperate woman making random holes in the earth. The stones were not thrown into the trench. They were placed. Each one chosen for its shape, tested for fit, adjusted for evenness, set with the precision of someone building to a plan that existed clearly somewhere, even if no one else on earth could see it. It did not look like madness. He didn't know what it looked like. But whatever it was producing something. A continuous stone-lined channel running into the hillside, growing longer and more deliberate with every stone she set. He thought of Ezra's voice. Stay away from her. She's not in her right mind. Grief does things to people. He looked at the trench. He looked at the careful stonework. He looked at the small woman working with a focus that bordered on ferocity. He turned and walked back to his mule. He untied the animal and continued down the trail toward town, and he told himself he was not going to come back. He had an apprenticeship to protect, a livelihood, a master who had taken him in at 17 and taught him everything he knew about building things that lasted. He made it 20 yards. Then he stopped. He stood in the pine-filtered light of a November afternoon and looked back over his shoulder at the hillside, at the thin figure in the trench, at the growing line of precisely set stones leading into the earth. He stood there for a long time. Then he kept walking, but the image stayed with him. It lodged behind his eyes the way splinters lodge in the skin, too small to remove, too persistent to ignore. And in the back of his mind, below the level where he had words for things, a question was forming that had the same shape as the question he had asked Ezra about the Harrison house. If the walls are thick enough, why is it still cold? He did not know yet what he was asking, but he knew that he would come back. Part 2. The Trench That Defied Everything. Black Hills, Dakota Territory. November 1887. The work had a rhythm now. Clara woke before dawn each morning in the dark of the cellar, her breath visible in the gray light, her body stiff from sleeping on packed earth. And she rose the way people rise when they have something to do that matters more than comfort. She ate a small portion of cornmeal mush cooked over a fire outside the entrance. She read the sky while the mush cooked, learning its language, the way Griffith had taught her to read rock. Paying attention to what the color of the horizon at first light was trying to say. Pale yellow meant dry cold, good for digging. The frozen ground would hold its shape. Deep gray meant snow coming, which meant the trench walls would soften and become unpredictable. On gray mornings, she hauled stones from the creek bed in the ravine below the hillside, instead of digging, carrying them up the slope one armful at a time and stacking them in sorted piles beside the cellar entrance. Flat stones for the channel floor, irregular ones for the sides, thin ones for the capstones that would eventually seal the channel into a closed passage. On yellow mornings, she dug. The trench had reached 20 feet by the middle of the third week of November. It ran from an opening she had knocked through the cellar wall outward and slightly downhill following the contour of the hillside. The stones she had laid in the first section were sealed at their joints with a mixture of clay and dried grass pressed into the gaps with her fingers until the channel was as tight as she could make it. At the far end, a vertical pipe rose 10 feet into the air above the snow line, its top open to the sky. It was not yet connected to anything. It was not yet finished. But it was growing one careful stone at a time, and every stone she set was a small argument against every person in Prospect who had decided this story was already over. Ezra Dunmore came on a Tuesday morning in the third week of November. He came on horseback, his breath steaming in the frigid air, his heavy coat dusted with frost from the ride. He had been hearing things, from Steck, who had told anyone who would listen about the widow trading her wedding ring for a stove and a pickaxe, from 2 separate families who had mentioned with the particular combination of concern and entertainment that small towns reserve for eccentricity that the Whitfield woman was digging some kind of underground trench on the hillside above the old homestead claim. Ezra had not come out of curiosity. He had come out of professional obligation, which in his case was genuinely indistinguishable from professional offense. He had built every sound structure in this valley. He had spent 30 years understanding what worked and what did not work against the particular brutality of Dakota winters, and if someone in his valley was building something that was gonna kill them, it fell within the boundaries of his responsibility to say so. He tied his horse to a pine tree and walked to the edge of the trench. He stood there for a full minute without speaking. His arms were crossed. His jaw moved slowly from side to side the way it did when he was processing something that did not fit cleanly into any category he had established. The trench was nearly 30 feet long. The stonework was careful fitted, sealed with clay. The vertical pipe at the far end rose clean and straight above the snow. Clara straightened up from where she was kneeling at the channel's edge. She rose slowly with the careful deliberateness of someone whose back had been speaking to her all morning. She looked at Ezra with the steady attention of a woman who had been expecting this visit and had already decided how she intended to conduct herself during it. Mrs. Whitfield. His voice carried the weight of a man accustomed to being the final authority on all matters of construction within 50 miles. What in God's name are you building? A flue, Mr. Dunmore? He stared at her. A flue goes up. He gestured skyward with one large hand, as though she might not be clear on the general direction. That is how a chimney works. Hot air rises, smoke rises, the draft pulls it upward and out. What you have built here goes sideways. The smoke will travel the length of this channel, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, almost conversational. The tone of someone explaining something they have thought about carefully and are not in any hurry to defend. The stone will absorb its heat as it passes. The earth around the stone will absorb the heat from the stone. By the time the smoke reaches the vertical pipe at the far end, most of its energy will have been transferred into the ground. The ground around my cellar will become warm, and it will stay warm, because earth changes temperature very slowly. Ezra opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. That is not how it works. His voice had hardened now, the patience of professional courtesy giving way to the friction of a man hearing something that sounded like heresy spoken about his own religion. You put a fire in that cellar, and the smoke has to go somewhere. If your flue runs sideways, the draft won't pull. The smoke will back up. It will fill your cellar and it will suffocate you in your sleep. He paused, and when he continued, his voice carried the specific gravity of a man wielding a true story as a weapon. I've seen it happen. A family in Deadwood, winter of '82. Father sealed the cabin too tight. Smoke backed up from a block chimney. They found all 4 of them in their beds in the morning. Clara did not flinch at the story. The system will draw, she said. The vertical pipe at the far end is the engine. The smoke inside that pipe will still be warmer than the outside air, so it will still rise. That rising column creates a low pressure that pulls the smoke through the entire horizontal section. The draft will be weaker than a conventional chimney, but it will be constant and it will be sufficient for a small stove with a controlled damper. Ezra looked at the stonework, at the clay ceiling, at the small intake pipe she had buried parallel to the main channel. He understood none of the principles she was describing. What he understood with a clarity that he found deeply uncomfortable was that this woman had just used the word pressure in a technical sense without hesitation, had described a mechanical system with the specificity of someone who had thought about it far more carefully than a grieving woman digging in the dirt was supposed to have thought about anything. He understood it, and he buried the understanding before it could become inconvenient. You are telling me, he said slowly, that everything I have built for 30 years is wrong. Clara looked at him for a moment, the same steady look she had given Calhoun when he nailed the notice to her door. The look of a woman who has decided that other people's discomfort is not her responsibility to manage, I'm not saying you're wrong, Mr. Dunmore. I'm saying there's another way. There is no other way." His voice rose now, and he could feel the heat of it in his own chest, the irrational fury of a man whose identity is being challenged by someone he has already decided is not qualified to challenge it. There is the right way and there is dying. That hole is a coffin. That trench is a grave, and you are digging both of them with your own hands. He pointed at the cellar entrance with one thick finger. "Stop this. Come to town. You can find a position somewhere. Someone will take you in. I'm building a home, Mr. Dunmore." She turned her back on him and knelt in the trench and began fitting another stone into place. Her hands moved with a precision that infuriated him precisely because precision implied knowledge and knowledge implied that she might not be as wrong as he needed her to be. Ezra Dunmore mounted his horse and rode back toward Prospect. By the time he reached the main street, his anger had cooled into something more durable and more dangerous. Conviction. The woman was going to die. And when she did, the town would feel the weight of it, and that weight would need somewhere to go, and Ezra Dunmore did not intend to be the man who had known and done nothing. He found Reverend Aldous Vane in the church vestry that afternoon. He told the minister about the trench, about the impossible flu, about the woman building something underground that was going to fill with smoke and kill her before January. Vane listened with the expression of a man calculating the geometry of a situation rather than the substance of it. A woman who had publicly refused his charity was now, according to the town's most respected builder, engaged in behavior that would end in her death. If she died, it would reflect on him. If he intervened and she survived, it restored the balance. "I'll speak with her," Vane said. He did not go alone. The days continued their work. Clara dug. She hauled stones. She sealed joints. She ate sparingly from Dorothea's provisions and supplemented them with wild onions she found near the creek and a rabbit she caught with a wire snare skinned with Griffith's pocket knife and cooked over an open fire outside the cellar entrance. She rationed the meat across 3 days with the methodical economy of someone who has made peace with the arithmetic of scarcity. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, but she was not starving. And then the rain came. 3 days of freezing rain that coated everything in a 1/4 inch of ice, and then turned to a wet, heavy snow that pressed down on the hillside like a hand trying to smother something. The soil which had held during the first 2 weeks had been saturated, and then frozen and saturated again, and was now unreliable in its depth, shifting between frozen crust and thawed mud in ways that could not be predicted from the surface. On the 12th day, the trench collapsed. Clara was kneeling in the channel when the south wall gave way. The earth slid inward with a low grinding sound, the kind a thing makes when it has been holding on longer than it should have and has finally given up. It came in a surge of mud and gravel that buried the 2 days of stonework she had just completed and filled the bottom of the channel with a thick slurry that erased the work the way a hand erases chalk from a board. She climbed out. She stood at the edge and looked at what was left. Her hands were raw. The blisters from the first week had hardened into calluses, but new wounds had opened under the old ones, and her palms were streaked with a mixture of mud and blood that she no longer bothered to clean away. Her left shin was a catalog of purple bruises from stones that had slipped in the wet. She had lost weight she could feel in the looseness of her clothing. She sat down at the mouth of the cellar and stared at the ruined trench, and felt for the first time since the morning Calhoun had nailed the notice to her door, the specific cold weight of doubt. Not doubt about the principles. She trusted Griffith's understanding of the earth with the same unexamined certainty that she trusted the sun to rise. He had spent 20 years underground learning rock and soil and water with his hands and his instruments and his careful observations. The principles in the journal were sound. She believed that the way you believe things that have been demonstrated to you by someone you would have trusted with your life. What she doubted was herself. Griffith had been an engineer. He had drawn this design for a crew of experienced miners men with 20 years of underground knowledge and the physical strength to execute his plans quickly before the conditions could change. This was not a design for a single woman with blistered hands and a nearly empty flour sack. She opened the journal to the last page Griffith had written. The handwriting was barely legible. The letters trembled with the effort of a man whose lungs were filling and whose hand was losing its argument with gravity. He had written it a week before he died, and she had read it so many times that she could have recited it in the dark. The earth does not require strength. It requires patience. The earth is not in a hurry, neither should we be. She sat with those words in the cold air of a failing afternoon, and she let herself feel the full weight of what they were telling her. Then she made a decision. She would not rebuild it the way Griffith had drawn it. His design called for a deep trench cut quickly and shored up with timber. That was a miner's approach built for speed and crew strength. She had neither. So she would do it differently. She would dig shallower sections only 1.5 feet at their deepest, and she would let each section freeze solid before extending the next. She would use the winter itself as her shoring. The permafrost that lay just below the thawed surface layer would become her foundation. Ice would hold the walls firm until she could line them with stone. It would take twice as long, but it would hold. And there was something else in the physics of it that she had not fully understood until the wall collapsed, and she had watched the mud slide and felt the difference between the frozen layer and the thawed layer beneath her feet. The frozen ground was a different material entirely from the soil above it. It was rigid and reliable the way a foundation should be. If she dug just above the permafrost using that layer as her floor, the walls would have something solid to lean against. It was not Griffith's way. It was hers. She picked up the shovel. The mud was still moving in places, settling into its new configuration. She began to dig again, slower this time, reading the soil with her fingertips, the way Griffith had taught her to read rock feeling for the boundary where the frozen ground met the thawed layer above. She found the line. She dug above it. She dug above. By the end of that day, she had advanced the channel 8 inches. Slow and ugly and nothing like the diagrams in the journal. But the walls held. She wiped her hands on her coat and looked at what she had made. 8 inches. She was still here. 8 inches was enough for tonight. Caleb Marsh came back on the last day of November. He came at dusk when the light was low enough to soften the edges of things, and the shadows under the pines were deep enough to conceal a person moving carefully. He had been thinking about the trench for 2 weeks, turning it over the way you turn over a problem that will not resolve into any shape you already have a name for. He had set the traps he had told Ezra he was checking. They had yielded 2 rabbits and a marten, which he had brought to the cellar on his second visit, along with a small bag of nails he had counted carefully from the workshop stores, so that the missing inventory would not register in Ezra's meticulous accounting. Tonight he had come with a pair of leather work gloves he had bought from a trapper in town, with his own wages and a jar of rendered bear grease for the cracks in Clara's hands, which he had noticed on his previous visits, had begun to split open at the knuckles in ways that would make precise work increasingly difficult. He found her sealing the joints of a newly completed section, pressing clay into the gaps with her thumb in the dim light of a small lantern. She looked up when she heard him. Her expression was not surprise. She had understood from the second visit that Caleb Marsh was going to keep coming back, and she had understood why, even if he had not yet understood it himself. He was a young man whose hands had been trained to recognize good work. and he had seen something in her trench that his hands recognized as good work. And that recognition was more compelling to him than any instruction from Ezra Dunmore. He set the gloves and the jar on the stone beside her without comment. Clara looked at them for a moment. The gloves were too large for her hands. She put them on anyway. They were the first gift she had received from anyone except Dorothea since Griffith died, and she held that fact quietly for a moment before picking up her clay and going back to work. They worked together for 2 hours without speaking. Caleb had spent 2 years with Ezra Dunmore, who believed that the most important lessons were delivered through silence and demonstration, rather than explanation. He had learned to watch a man's hands and understand what they were doing and why without needing to be told. He watched Clara's hands now the way he had watched Ezra's hands at the beginning, with the full and genuine attention of someone who wants to understand something real. When they had completed the section and sat back from the trench to review it in the lamplight, Caleb finally spoke. "I want to understand how this works," he said. Clara rose from the trench. She went to the cellar and came back with a single tallow candle and a match. She positioned the candle at the cellar end of the completed channel, at the point where the stovepipe connection would eventually be made. She lit it. A small yellow flame appeared in the darkness. "Put your hand at the other end," she said. The other end was 30 feet away at the base of the vertical exhaust pipe. Caleb walked to it and knelt and held his palm near the opening. For a moment there was nothing. Then he felt it, a faint, steady movement of air. Not a draft in the conventional sense, not the kind of random cold movement that happened in any uninsulated space. Something directed. Something that had traveled 30 feet through a sealed stone channel drawn by nothing more than the heat of a single candle flame at one end, creating the smallest possible difference in pressure at the other. Caleb pulled his hand back. He stared at the opening. He looked back at Clara, who was standing at the candle end of the channel 30 feet away, watching him with the patient attention of someone who has already run this experiment in her mind many times and knows exactly what he is feeling. He put his hand back near the opening. The airflow was still there, faint and constant and completely real. The heat of the candle was pulling air through 30 feet of stone that was lying flat on the ground, not rising, not following any principle he had been taught, just moving steadily and inexorably, because the physics of pressure and temperature did not care about the direction Ezra Dunmore had spent 30 years building chimneys. "It works," Caleb said. His voice cracked on the second word. Not from emotion. From the physical sensation of feeling something he had believed to be certain dissolve in the palm of his hand. Clara blew out the candle. "Yes," she said simply. Caleb sat back on his heels in the snow and looked at the dark mouth of the channel and said nothing for a long time. He was rearranging things inside himself. The process was quiet and almost entirely invisible from the outside, but it was thorough. The way a man reorganizes a workshop when he has discovered that the layout he has been working with for years is making every job harder than it needs to be. 2 years of building. 2 years of learning the right way to do things from a man who was genuinely expert in the right way. And at the end of 30 feet of stone laid sideways in a hillside, a door had opened onto something that the right way had not yet included. He thought of the question he had asked about Harrison's cold house. He thought of the smoke rising fast and straight from the Mercer chimney, climbing into the sky as though it could not escape fast enough. He thought about where the heat had gone. "I won't tell Mr. Dunmore," he said. "You should tell him," Clara replied, already walking back toward the cellar. "But wait until it works." The 3 men came on horseback 3 days later. It was a Thursday morning, the sky the color of iron, the air carrying the particular stillness that precedes heavy snow. Clara was working the new section of the trench, reading the soil with her hands, finding the permafrost boundary. With the patience she had found in the wreckage of the third collapse, she heard the horses before she saw them. She stood up. Reverend Aldous Vane rode in the center, his dark coat straight across his shoulders, his expression composed with the particular arrangement of concern and authority that he had developed over many years of pastoral intervention. On either side of him rode two members of his congregation. Both were solid men with families and the kind of social presence in a small community that communicates weight without requiring explanation. They were not here to help her. She understood the mechanics of this visit as clearly as she had understood the mechanics of Vane's charity offer. The men on either side were witnesses. Their presence communicated that this was not a private pastoral conversation, but a communal intervention, the kind that in Dakota Territory in 1887 could, if it escalated, become the foundation for legal action. A woman declared mentally unfit by her minister and her community's most respected builder could be removed from her situation with very little formal process. Vane did not waste time on pleasantries. "Mrs. Whitfield." His voice carried across the frozen hillside with the practiced resonance of a man accustomed to filling a room with his words. "The town is concerned about you. Mr. Dunmore has shared his assessment of what you're building here, and his professional opinion is that this construction poses a serious danger to your life." Clara looked at the three men on their horses. She was standing in a trench covered in clay and dried mud, her oversized work gloves darkened with earth. There was nothing about her appearance that lent itself to the kind of authority she needed in this moment. She had one move. She climbed out of the trench and walked to the cellar entrance without rushing. She reached inside and retrieved Griffith's journal. She walked back to the horses and held it up open to the ventilation diagrams. "My husband was a mining engineer for 20 years, she said. He spent his career studying the movement of air underground. These are his designs. What I'm building is based on principles he developed over 2 decades of practical observation." She looked at Vane directly. "This isn't grief, Reverend. This is engineering." Vane dismounted and took the journal from her hands. He looked at the pages. Dense handwriting in English and Welsh mixed together. Precise diagrams of shafts and airflow patterns and thermal gradients with measurements and annotations in a small, careful hand. Arrows indicating the direction of air movement. Calculations in the margins involving numbers and symbols that meant nothing to a man whose relationship with the physical world was mediated entirely through scripture and pastoral authority. It was as foreign to him as the surface of the moon. He understood nothing in those pages. Not one equation, not one diagram, not one principle that the careful hand of Griffith Whitfield had spent 20 years developing in the darkness below the earth. But he could not say that, because saying it would mean admitting that the woman standing in front of him with clay on her gloves and mud on her coat understood something that he did not, and that admission would dismantle the entire purpose of the visit. He had ridden 2 hours through freezing air with 2 witnesses specifically to project the authority of superior judgment. Acknowledging that her expertise exceeded his would not merely fail to accomplish that purpose, it would reverse it entirely. So he looked at the pages with the expression of a man conducting a careful review. He spent 40 seconds on the diagrams. Then he closed the journal and handed it back. "I'll pray for you, Mrs. Whitfield." The words landed in the cold air between them and settled there. It was the most precise instrument in his arsenal. When Reverend Aldous Vane announced that he was praying for someone in a town the size of Prospect, the announcement traveled through the congregation by Sunday and arrived at every household draped in the quiet, cautious pity reserved for the doomed. It was not a threat he could be challenged on. It contained no explicit statement that could be contradicted. It was simply a public positioning of Clara Whitfield as a person whose situation had moved beyond the reach of human reason and into the exclusive jurisdiction of divine intervention. Clara took the journal back. She held it against her chest. She looked at the three men on their horses, and at the minister standing between them, and at the 40 seconds he had spent pretending to evaluate 2 decades of her husband's life's work. "Thank you, Reverend," she said. Vane remounted. The 3 men rode back down the hill. Clara stood at the edge of the trench and watched them go, her hands resting on the journal cover, and felt the specific trembling that comes not from cold, but from the sustained effort of remaining completely calm in the presence of men who have the power to take away the only thing you have left. She had won this round, not because she had persuaded anyone, because she had not given them what they needed to act, but the clock was running now. If the system failed, if the smoke backed up, if Caleb found her unconscious from carbon monoxide and reported it to Ezra, who would report it to Vane, who already had his prayers publicly on record, the next visit would not be a conversation. She looked at the trench. She picked up her shovel. Dorothea Voss stayed after the Sunday service to help arrange hymnals. This was not unusual. Dorothea was one of the reliable women of the congregation, the kind who showed up early and stayed late and did the unglamorous work that made the visible work possible. Vane depended on women like Dorothea with the comfortable unconsciousness of a man who has always had his practical needs attended to. He found her in the vestibule, pulling on her coat as the last of the congregation filed out into the cold. "Dorothea." He kept his voice warm, pastoral, the voice he used for delicate subjects. "I understand you've been visiting Mrs. Whitfield on the hill." Dorothea buttoned her coat. She was in no hurry. "I have. I appreciate your compassion for her, truly I do. But I wonder whether you've considered that, by bringing her provisions, you may be enabling her to continue down a path that will end in harm. If she were hungry enough, she would come back to town. She would accept help. By feeding her, you're allowing her to persist in a delusion that could cost her life." Dorothea finished buttoning. She pulled on her gloves. She had been waiting with the patience of a woman who had learned that patience was the most effective weapon available to her for exactly this conversation. She had been composing her response to it in small pieces over weeks, in the quiet hours of a house where only one person now slept. "My husband died underground in '79, Reverend." Her voice was entirely level. "He died because the men who owned that mine, men who were educated and respected, and absolutely certain of their own judgment, told everyone that the ventilation was adequate, that the air was safe, that the system was working as it should." She paused. "And my husband trusted them, because they were the authorities, because they had the credentials, because they had ridden up to the entrance of that mine and looked at the equipment and rendered their expert opinion." She picked up her prayer book from the bench beside her. "He went underground every morning believing he was safe, because important men said so. And one morning the air was not safe, and he did not come back up." She walked toward the door. "Sometimes people don't die from lack of help, Reverend Vane. They die from the wrong kind." She pushed open the vestibule door and walked into the cold. Aldous Vane stood in the empty vestibule with his Bible pressed against his ribs. 2 women who had been straightening the hymnals on the back pew had heard every word of the exchange. He could hear them not quite moving behind him. He stood there for a long moment. Then he walked to his office and closed the door and sat down at his desk and opened a book at random and did not read a word of it. The first day of December arrived cold and clear, the sky a hard, brilliant blue that looked beautiful and meant nothing kind. Clara had been on the hillside for 27 days. The channel was complete. 31 feet of stone-lined passage running from the cellar wall outward and downhill, sealed at every joint. with clay and dried grass capped with flat stones pressed into a mortar bed that had frozen solid in the November cold and was harder now than the stone itself. The vertical exhaust pipe rose 10 feet above the snow at the far end, its top protected from direct snowfall by a small stone cap that allowed air to exit laterally. The fresh air intake ran parallel to the main channel, a 4-inch pipe buried 8 inches underground, its inlet standing 2 feet above the snow line at the hillside end, its outlet emerging near the floor of the cellar on the opposite side of the stove from the flue connection. The small pot-bellied stove sat in the center of the cellar, connected by a short section of stovepipe, not to a hole in the ceiling as any reasonable person would have arranged it, but downward into the mouth of the horizontal channel. It was the thing that Ezra Dunmore had declared impossible. She had built it with her own hands in 27 days in November in the Black Hills. Now she was going to find out if the principles of a dead man's journal were as sound as she believed them to be. She gathered a handful of damp grass from the pile she kept inside the cellar for exactly this test. She opened the stove's loading door. She held the burning match to the grass and waited until it caught. And then she placed the small, smoldering bundle inside the stove and stepped back and watched the smoke. It rose from the burning grass in a thin gray column toward the stovepipe connection. At the junction where the pipe turned downward, the smoke hesitated. This was the moment that everything depended on, the moment where the physics of it either held or failed, where Griffith's understanding of pressure and heat was either the truth he had spent 20 years accumulating underground or the wishful thinking of a dying man. The smoke hesitated for 3 seconds. Then it moved. It did not billow back into the cellar. It did not hang in the air and spread. It slid downward into the stovepipe with a clean, decisive motion, the way water moves when it finally finds its level, and disappeared into the horizontal channel below. Clara stood absolutely still. She counted to 20. Then she ran, out of the cellar, around the face of the hillside, through the snow and the hawthorn canes and the frozen raspberry brush to the far end of the channel, where the vertical exhaust pipe stood above the snow line. She leaned close to the top of the pipe and looked. A thin wisp of vapor curled from its opening and dissolved almost immediately into the cold air above. Not smoke. Not the thick gray evidence of a fire burning badly in a confined space. Almost nothing. A translucent ghost of combustion that had traveled 31 feet through stone and earth and given up almost everything it contained along the way. The smoke had found its way. Clara straightened up. She stood in the December snow in the middle of a hillside in the Black Hills and felt something move through her chest that she did not have a word for. It was not triumph. Triumph is too loud for what she felt. It was quieter than that, deeper. The specific quality of relief that comes when something you have believed in completely without proof against the resistance of everyone around you turns out to be exactly as true as you believed it was. She thought of Griffith sitting at the kitchen table with his notebooks spread around him, talking about the temperature of deep rock, his eyes bright with the pleasure of understanding something that most people had never thought to look at. She thought of his hand pressing hers against the warm stone on that summer hillside. Stone has a longer memory than people Mara. It remembers summer long after we've forgotten. She went back to the cellar. She loaded 2 small logs into the stove. She closed the damper until the fire was barely more than a controlled smolder. She sat on the 3-legged stool she had made from salvaged timber in the second week and opened Seneca to the middle and began to read. She did not need to check the temperature. Within an hour, she could feel it in the walls. Not a dramatic change. Not the aggressive, localized heat of a fireplace that scorched your front while your back remained cold. Something entirely different. The cellar walls, which had been the cold they always were in winter, began to release a faint, pervasive warmth that seemed to have no single source. It did not come from the stove, which was barely glowing. It came from everywhere at once, from the stone and the clay, and the packed earth that surrounded her, from the hillside itself, which had been slowly and quietly absorbing the heat that passed through the channel, and was now with equal slowness and quietness beginning to give it back. By evening, the cellar registered 60 degrees. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 4 below zero. Clara set Seneca aside. She pressed her palm flat against the wall and held it there. The stone was warm under her hand. Warm from the inside, the way Griffith's rock had been warm on that summer afternoon. The warmth of something that had been gathering and holding and waiting. She closed her eyes. The warmth moved through her palm, up her arm, into her chest, and settled there like the answer to a question she had been holding for 2 years. "Thank you," she whispered. She fed the stove a single additional log. Before she slept, turned the damper down to its lowest setting, and lay down on the narrow bed she had made from the salvaged shelf and a folded blanket. Outside, the wind moved through the pine branches with a sound like breathing. Inside the earth, in a small, warm room that the cold could not find, Clara Whitfield slept. She used less than 1/10 of the wood that any family in a log cabin in Prospect was burning that night to stay alive. December was only beginning. Part 3. The storm that settled every argument. Black Hills, Dakota Territory. January 12th, 1888. The morning lied. It arrived warm, genuinely and disarmingly warm. The kind of January morning that makes 30 years of Dakota winters feel like a misremembering. The temperature climbed to within a few degrees of 40. Icicles that had been growing from the eaves of every building in Prospect since mid-November began to drip. Children ran between houses in their shirt sleeves, laughing at the novelty of ground they could see again at sunlight that actually carried some suggestion of heat. The old-timers did not laugh. The old-timers stood on their porches and looked north and said nothing, and went back inside and checked their wood piles. Caleb Marsh stood outside Ezra Dunmore's workshop in the unusual warmth and watched the northern horizon. The sky there had taken on a color he had no previous name for. A bruised yellowish gray, the color of old tallow that sat along the edge of the world, like a stain spreading through wet cloth. The air was too still. The birds had gone quiet an hour ago. Not the gradual quieting of a normal winter afternoon, but a sudden total silence, as though every creature within range of that northern sky had received the same message simultaneously and decided that silence was the appropriate response. He thought of something Clara had said to him the week before. He had climbed the hill one last time after the system was complete, needing to confirm with his own hands what he had felt at the end of that channel in the dark. He needed to press his palms against the cellar walls and feel what was there before he could fully trust that the thing he had helped build was real and not an elaborate accident of perception. Clara had been sitting at her small table reading the stove, barely glowing, the air around her dry and warm and completely clean. He had put both hands flat against the wall and held them there for a long time, feeling the steady, sourceless warmth coming back into his palms, and had not been able to say anything at all. On his way down the hill, he had paused and looked back at the dark entrance of the cellar. And Clara had been standing in the doorway watching the sky, and she had said almost to herself the way people say things they have heard from someone they miss. That Griffith used to say, when winter gives you a warm day in January, it is always collecting what it lent you, and it always collects tenfold. Caleb looked at the yellow sky. He thought about debt. He thought about the things that were owed. Then the sky fell. There was no warning that the people of Prospect would have recognized as a warning. One moment the air was warm and still, and the icicles were dripping from the eaves of the church. The next moment, a wall of gray descended from the north with the speed of something that had been held back by tremendous force and had finally been released all at once. The temperature did not drop gradually. It plunged 40 degrees in 20 minutes, 50 degrees in 40, 60 degrees in less than an hour. A rate of change that the human body registers not as cold but as assault. The wind that accompanied it was not the ordinary wind of a Dakota winter storm. It was a different animal entirely. It arrived without the usual preliminary gusts that serve as announcement. It arrived at full force, a horizontal river of air, moving at 50 miles an hour, carrying snow so fine and so dense that it was not snow in any familiar sense, but a solid white medium through which nothing could be seen and nothing could be moved with any certainty of arriving where it intended. In prospect, the world became a white room with no walls and no floor, and no ceiling. Visibility dropped to nothing in minutes. A man standing on his own porch could not see the fence post 10 feet away. Children who had been running between houses in their shirt sleeves 20 minutes before were suddenly moving through a darkness that had no navigable features, no landmarks, no sense of direction that the body could reliably trust. History would record it as the schoolchildren's blizzard, named for the particular cruelty of its timing, arriving at the hour when children across the northern plains were walking home from school through conditions that had been 20 minutes earlier, the mildest afternoon in weeks. Many of them would not arrive. The storm would collect what winter had lent that warm morning, and it would collect it from the most vulnerable people available, as debt collectors in all eras have always preferred to do. In prospect, the bell of the Presbyterian church began to ring. Reverend Vane pulling the rope from inside the vestibule, giving the town something to orient by in the white darkness. Families pulled children indoors. Men who had been outside working fought their way back to their structures by memory and desperation. Doors were wedged shut against wind that was not merely weather, but a physical force with apparent intentions. And in the finest log house in the valley, Ezra Dunmore began to burn his winter. He had been in the workshop when the storm hit. He had heard the door blow open with a sound like a rifle shot, and had turned and seen the white wall coming through it, and had understood in the same instant that something had changed in the fundamental nature of the day. He fought the door shut, barred it, and ran through the connecting passage to the main house. Nora was already there, moving the children away from the windows. Clem, 7 years old, had been developing a cough for 2 weeks. The kind of deep rattling cough that worsened at night and had been putting hollow circles under his eyes, and a particular worried stillness in Nora's face when she thought Ezra was not watching. Pearl, 5 years old, pressed herself against her mother's side and shivered with the instinctive recognition that children have of adult fear, even when the adults are doing their best to conceal it. Ezra went to the fireplace and built the fire up. He built it the way he had built fires in hard winters for 30 years, deliberately, efficiently, with the confidence of a man who understands his tools and trusts them. Split oak on the bottom, pine. On top, damper fully open for maximum draft fire, laid for maximum heat output. Within 15 minutes, the hearth held a fire that roared and threw light across the room and produced the kind of aggressive, radiant heat that could be felt from 8 feet away. The fire was magnificent. The room remained cold. Not cold the way a room is cold when a fire has just been lit. Cold the way a room is cold when something fundamental about its relationship with warmth has been disrupted. The fire filled the fireplace with enough heat to warm a room twice this size, and the air 8 feet from the flames was cold enough to see breath. Ezra added more wood. The fire grew larger. The room grew colder. He stood in front of the blaze, with the heat scorching his face, and felt the cold pressing against his back. And for the first time in 30 years, the thing he was feeling did not have a name in his vocabulary. He knew heat. He knew cold. He knew construction. He knew the principles of a well-built home in winter weather. He had built this house with his own hands, the finest house he had ever built, and it was performing in direct contradiction to everything he had ever believed about houses. He added more wood. By mid-afternoon, a third of his winter supply was gone. Clem's cough had deepened into something wet and frightening, the kind of sound that the body makes when it is spending resources it cannot afford to spend on the sustained effort of fighting two things at once. Ezra placed his hand on his son's forehead and felt the terrible contradiction of a body that was burning from within while being drained from without a furnace and a sieve at the same time. He wrapped the boy in every blanket they owned. He added more wood. Nora watched him from across the room without speaking. She had been watching him all afternoon with an expression he had not seen in 17 years of marriage. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something quieter and more devastating than either, the expression of a woman who has known for some time that a particular reckoning was coming and has been waiting with whatever patience she could assemble for her husband to arrive at it. She had known something since December that she had not told him. She had been turning that knowledge over in her mind for 6 weeks, examining it from every angle, weighing the cost of telling him against the cost of not telling him, and arriving each time at the same conclusion. He would not have listened. Not in November, when the certainty in him was still solid and untested. Not in December, when the first hard cold had come and his house had handled it adequately enough to confirm his confidence. He needed to arrive at the question himself through his own experience before the answer would be anything other than a provocation. She thought, watching him add another log to the fire that was consuming their winter and warming nothing, that he had arrived. Outside, the temperature continued to fall. It happened near midnight. The children had finally fallen into the fitful, shallow sleep of people who are exhausted, but not comfortable. Pearl pressed against Nora's side, Clem breathing with the labored deliberateness of someone for whom breathing had become a conscious effort. The fire had died back to a low, steady burn, not because Ezra had managed it down, but because the woodpile against the wall had entered the range where each log required a conscious decision to spend. Ezra sat on the floor beside the fire with his back against the stone surround and looked at the flames. He had been looking at them for 2 hours. He was looking at the way the heat rose from the wood in shimmering columns, the way it gathered at the top of the firebox and turned the corner and rushed up the flue with an eagerness that he had always taken as evidence of a system working correctly. A good draft, a strong upward pull, the signature of a well-built chimney. He watched the heat leave. He watched it rush upward and vanish, pouring out of the top of his chimney into a blizzard that was currently at 35 below zero. And he thought about where that heat went and what replaced it. And he felt in the specific architecture of what was happening in this room, the shape of something he had never allowed himself to see before. Every fire he had ever built and every house he had ever constructed had required air to burn. The fire consumed the air in the room, and the room replaced that air by drawing it in from outside, through every crack and seam and nail hole and gap that existed in the structure, because nature does not permit a vacuum, and cold air will always find the place where warm air has been consumed. The bigger the fire, the more air it consumed. The more air it consumed, the more cold air the house drew in to replace it. His fireplace was not warming his house. His fireplace was an engine that exchanged warm air for cold air at the maximum possible rate, and the wood he was burning was the fuel that powered that exchange. The bigger the fire, the faster the exchange. The faster the exchange, the colder the room beyond the fire's immediate radius. He had been building beautiful, expensive, elaborately crafted machines for exchanging warmth for cold and calling them homes for 30 years. The thought arrived not as an insight, but as a verdict. He sat with it for a long time. Nora's voice came from the darkness of the bedroom, quiet and steady. Ezra. He did not answer immediately. The Whitfield woman. Clara. Where is she now? The question landed in the space between them with the precision of something that had been aimed carefully. Ezra looked at the fire. He knew what he believed. He had believed it since November. The Welsh widow had built a smoke trap in a hillside and had asphyxiated herself in it, and her body was frozen in the earth. And in the spring, someone would have to go up that hill and deal with the consequences of her stubbornness and her refusal to accept the help that had been offered to her. That was the story he had constructed and inhabited. It was the only version of events consistent with everything he knew. She's dead, he said. And then, because Nora's silence had a particular quality that he had learned over 17 years to pay attention to, he said, "Why?" Nora was quiet for a moment. "Caleb told me something in early December, when you were finishing the Mercer job." Another pause. He went up to that cellar more than once. He helped her with the stonework. She waited. He said it was warm, Ezra. He said the air was clean. He said the walls were warm to the touch and the stove was barely burning, and she was reading at her table as comfortable as any person in any house in this valley. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ezra Dunmore had ever heard. It was louder than the blizzard hammering the walls of his finest house. It was louder than his son's labored breathing from the bedroom. It was the sound of 6 weeks of certainty cracking along a fault line that had always been there, that he had known was there, that he had spent 6 weeks walking carefully around. "You've known since December." His voice was flat. "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "No." A long pause. "You wouldn't have listened." Nora said simply. She was right. He knew she was right with the immediate and complete recognition of a man hearing a true thing about himself that he has been avoiding. In November and December, he would have been furious. He would have confronted Caleb and called it a betrayal. He would have ridden up that hill and told Clara that one cold weather test proved nothing. He would have constructed an argument from his 30 years of experience and his professional reputation and his genuinely held convictions. And the argument would have been impressive and thorough and completely wrong. And the certainty he felt while making it would have been indistinguishable from the certainty he had felt about everything else he had ever built. His wrongness and his pride had the same face. He had never been able to tell them apart from the inside. Clem coughed from the bedroom, a deep, rattling liquid sound that had no business coming from a 7-year-old chest. Ezra Dunmore stood up. He put on every piece of clothing he owned, layering wool over flannel over cotton, pulling 2 pairs of socks over feet that were already cold, wrapping a scarf around his face until only his eyes were exposed. He pulled his heaviest coat over everything and felt the bulk of it, the familiar weight of preparation, the same weight he had felt every winter morning of his adult life. Nora watched him from the doorway of the bedroom. "Where are you going?" He looked at his wife. "To find out if I've been a fool." He opened the front door. The blizzard entered the room like a physical thing, a solid presence that shoved him backward a step and covered the floor in white in the time it took to breathe. He stepped out and pulled the door shut behind him, and the world closed around him like a fist. He had built every structure in the valley, which meant he knew the valley. He knew it the way a carpenter knows his own hands, not as a mapped and measured abstraction, but as a felt reality, a set of distances and gradients and landmarks stored in the body rather than the mind. He knew the slope of the ground between his house and the Pine Ridge. He knew the way the terrain changed at the creek crossing. how the ground dropped on the far bank and then rose toward the hawthorn thickets that marked the old homestead claim. He navigated by that knowledge in a darkness so complete and a wind so overwhelming that navigation by any other means was impossible. He counted steps. He felt the ground's angle through his boots. He moved into the wind because the wind was coming from the north, and the hillside was north and west of his house. And that was all he knew and all he needed to know. He had brought the shovel. At the creek crossing, he went through the ice to his knee and came out the other side with one boot full of water that began to freeze before he had taken 10 steps. He did not stop. He registered the information and kept moving because stopping in a blizzard at 35 below zero is a specific kind of decision that requires more certainty about the future than he currently possessed. The ground began to rise. He was at the base of the hillside. He pushed through what he thought were the hawthorn thickets, the branches dragging at his coat, the thorns pulling at the frozen wool, and he angled uphill by feel, placing each foot carefully in ground he could not see. He was looking for a door, a small wooden door in the side of a hill that he had dismissed 2 months ago as the entrance to a tomb. He found the mounds of snow-covered hawthorn by stumbling into them. He felt for the entrance by kneeling and sweeping his arms across the snow in widening arcs. He found the slight depression where the door had been set into the hillside. He dug with the shovel, and then with his arms, and then when the shovel became useless in the packed drift, with his bare hands inside 2 pairs of frozen gloves. His knuckles struck wood. He dug the last of the snow away from the top of the door and found the handle and pulled. The door swung open. The warmth hit him in the face. He stopped. Not a blast of heat. Nothing violent or aggressive. A gentle, steady exhalation of warm, dry air that moved over his ice-crusted skin with the quality of something that had been waiting patiently for a long time. It was the warmth of a space that had been consistently, reliably, quietly warm for weeks. Not the sharp, localized heat of a fire, but something deeper and more even. Something that seemed to come from the walls and the floor, and the low ceiling and the very air itself. Ezra stood at the top of the 3 short steps and could not move. He stood there in the howling dark with the warmth washing over him, and he tried to organize his experience into something his mind could manage and could not. He had built every warm space he had ever entered. He knew how warmth worked in a constructed environment. He knew what a fire felt like from various distances. He knew the difference between a well-insulated room and a poorly insulated one. He knew every variation of interior warmth that 30 years of building had exposed him to. This was not any of them. He descended the 3 steps. Clara Whitfield was sitting at her small table. She was mending a tear in her wool blanket with a needle and thread, working in the light of a single tallow candle. The pot-bellied stove against the far wall held a single small log that was burning with the controlled, barely there combustion of something that had been managed for maximum efficiency. The damper was nearly closed. The stove was barely glowing. The air in the cellar was warm and dry and completely clean. There was no smoke, no damp, no cold spot, no draft. Clara looked up. Her expression was not surprise. It was not triumph. It was the expression of a woman who has been waiting with great patience for a particular moment to arrive, and has spent that waiting time deciding how she wants to be present in it when it does. Ezra stepped into the center of the cellar. He was enormous in that small earthen room, 6 feet 3 inches of frost-encrusted coat and frozen beard filling the space in a way that should have made it feel crowded. He turned slowly and looked at the walls, at the earthen ceiling, at the stovepipe disappearing into the floor, at the small intake pipe emerging near the base of the opposite wall. He reached out with one gloved hand and pressed it flat against the wall beside him. The wall was warm. He held his hand there. He was the finest builder in the Black Hills. He had built walls of white oak 8 inches thick and stone chimneys massive enough to anchor any fire a Dakota winter demanded, and dovetail joints so tight that not a thread of cold air could find its way through. He had spent 30 years building barriers between the people he cared about and the thing that wanted to kill them. And the earthen wall of a widow's root cellar was warmer than anything he had ever built. He held his hand against it and felt the warmth come through his frozen glove and into his frozen fingers. And he stood very still, while 30 years of absolute certainty reorganized themselves into something smaller and more honest. The silence between them lasted a long time. When he spoke, the word came out as something between a question and a confession. How? Not a technical question. The technical understanding would come later, and he would find when it did that he had the vocabulary for it after all, that the principles were not foreign to him, but had simply been arranged in a way he had never thought to arrange them. The question he was asking now was not about engineering. It was about what it cost a man to be wrong for 30 years while believing he was protecting the people he loved. Clara set down her mending. She looked at the man standing in her cellar with his hand pressed against her wall, and ice melting off his coat into the packed dirt floor. She had thought about this moment many times in the past 2 months, had imagined various versions of it in the long, warm evenings by the barely glowing stove. She had imagined herself feeling vindicated. She had imagined the particular satisfaction of a person who has been told repeatedly that they are wrong, discovering that they were right. She did not feel any of those things. What she felt was the deep, bone-level weariness of a person who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. "Your family is cold, Mr. Dunmore," she said. "Bring them here." The return journey should have taken 20 minutes. It took Ezra 40, not because he moved slowly, but because the storm had intensified in the hour since he had left his house, piling new drifts across the path he had broken, filling in his footprints until they were indistinguishable from the general surface of the white world. But he was a man who had just had his certainty broken open in the warmth of an earthen room, and the breaking had made room for something that had not been there before. Not hope exactly. Something more functional than hope. The specific clarity of a man who knows exactly what he has to do and is no longer spending any energy on anything else. He came through his own front door and found Nora exactly where he had left her, curled around the children on the bed, her body the last warm thing in the house. "Get up," he said. "Get the children dressed. Everything they own. We're going." Nora looked at his face. She had seen her husband in many states over 17 years. She had seen him proud and tired and angry and tender, and once briefly afraid. The man standing in her doorway covered in ice and melted snow, and the particular looseness that comes from having been fundamentally restructured, was something different from all of them. She dressed the children without another word. Ezra carried Clem, who was too weak to walk. The boy was burning with fever, his weight in his father's arms feeling both too heavy and devastatingly light. The heaviness of a sick child, and the lightness of a child who does not have reserves to spare. Nora carried Pearl, who had stopped crying, which Ezra knew from experience was not better than crying. They went out into the screaming white dark. Ezra led breaking trail, using his body as a barrier against the wind for the people behind him. Nora followed in his footsteps with the trust of a woman who had made a decision about her husband that night and intended to honor it. The wind hit them with everything it had. The cold was an assault and a presence and a judgment all at once, and it found every gap in their layered clothing, every inch of exposed skin, every second they were not moving fast enough. They crossed the creek. They climbed the rise. They found the hawthorn mounds by the same stumbling method Ezra had used an hour before. He dug the door out again. He pulled it open. The warmth came out to meet them. Nora stepped inside and stopped in the center of the room and stood completely still for a moment that stretched long enough to contain several different kinds of understanding. Then she pressed her free hand, Pearl still on her hip, flat against the cellar wall. She held it there. She looked at the wall, at the earthen ceiling, at the barely glowing stove, at the single candle, at the woman who had been living in this impossible room since November and was standing quietly by her table watching them with the expression of someone who has already done all the difficult feeling available for a given situation and has arrived at the other side of it. "You've been alone here 2 months," Nora said slowly, "and you're warmer than anyone in the valley." It was not a question. It was the specific sound of a reckoning being completed, of a thing being seen clearly for the first time after being obscured for a long time. Clara took Clem from Ezra's arms without asking. She was gentle and efficient, unwrapping the boy from his outer layers with the practiced care of someone who has thought about warmth as a managed resource rather than an ambient condition. She laid him on her narrow bed and covered him with her own blanket and placed her hand briefly on his forehead, registering what was there. He was running high, but the violent shivering that had been consuming his small body's reserves began to ease within minutes of entering the cellar. The warmth working on him, the way warmth works on a body that has been spending everything. It has just to maintain basic temperature. His fists unclenched. His breathing slowed and deepened. The particular tightness around his eyes relaxed. Within an hour, he was sleeping. Pearl fell asleep against her mother, pressed into the corner of the cellar. That was the warmest spot, the place where the earthen walls met and the accumulated thermal mass of the hillside was deepest. Ezra sat on the floor with his back against the warm wall. He watched his son sleep. He watched Nora's breathing slow and steady as exhaustion finally won. He watched Clara move quietly around the cellar, adding a single small log to the stove, with the practiced precision of a woman who had learned through weeks of experimentation exactly how much fuel was required to keep the thermal system charged without wasting what she had. She adjusted the damper with 2 fingers, a specific incremental turn that represented a calibration he could not have performed without weeks of the same experimentation. He looked at the stovepipe disappearing into the floor. He traced the path of it in his mind, the horizontal channel below, the stone-lined passage running outward and downhill through the earth, the heat transferring from the smoke into the stone, from the stone into the earth holding and releasing slowly, the whole hillside becoming a gentle, persistent furnace that operated on patience rather than power. He saw the elegance of it. He saw it with the eyes of a builder, which meant he also saw the improvements, the places where the stone could be fitted more precisely, the way a timber frame could shore the earthen walls for permanence, the way the system could be scaled, integrated into a structure that stood above ground as well as below it, the way his knowledge of conventional construction and Griffith Whitfield's knowledge of earth and air could be combined into something that neither of them could have designed alone. He looked at Clara, who had sat back down at her table and opened her husband's journal. She did not look at him. She was not performing patience. She was simply giving him the time he needed to finish arriving at where he was going, because she had learned in this cellar, over these months, that you cannot hurry the process by which a person comes to understand something they were not ready to understand. He looked at the journal in her hands, at the worn leather cover, soft from years of being handled by two different people, at the way she held it with the ease of something that had become part of her daily weight. "Your husband was a brilliant man," he said. His voice was rough from the cold and from something else. Clara looked up. "Yes," she said. "He was." A pause. "And I was a proud fool." Clara looked at him for a long moment, at the giant, frost-encrusted man sitting on her earthen floor with his back against her warm wall. His hands open in his lap, the 30-year certainty gone from his face and replaced by something raw and more honest, and she thought more genuinely useful. "You were a good builder who hadn't yet learned everything," she said. It was the most generous assessment Ezra Dunmore had ever received of a failing he fully deserved, and it cost her nothing to give it, and it landed in him like something warm in a cold place. He sat with it. Outside, the blizzard screamed on. Inside the earth, 4 people and one barely glowing stove held the dark and the cold at a permanent and comfortable distance. The storm broke on the 3rd day. The silence that followed was as shocking as the storm itself. A vast, ringing stillness that the ears and nerves did not know how to process after 72 hours of continuous assault. The temperature remained brutal, but the wind was gone, and in the absence of the wind, the brutal cold became merely extreme cold, which was something the Black Hills understood how to manage. Prospect emerged slowly. The damage was serious. 2 families had lost members: an elderly man who had gone out to check on his animals and had not found his way back, and a 16-year-old girl who had been 200 yards from her own front door when the visibility dropped. Nearly every household had suffered. Wood supplies were devastated. The cold had found every weakness in every structure and had demonstrated with the thoroughness of a long and patient exam exactly where each building's understanding of winter had been insufficient. The news that Ezra Dunmore and his family had survived by sheltering in the Whitfield cellar traveled through the town within hours of the storm's end. The reaction moved through several stages in quick succession. Disbelief because the entire town had assumed Clara was dead. Confusion because the entire town had agreed that her project was insane. And then arriving with the uncomfortable inevitability of something that has been delayed too long, the recognition that they had been wrong. Not a comfortable recognition, not the clean, cathartic acknowledgement of error that people imagine they will feel when the truth finally arrives. More like the discovery that you have been sitting on something sharp for so long that the pain had become part of the background, and you had stopped attributing it to a specific cause. Reverend Aldous Vane came to the cellar on the 4th day after the storm. He came alone, no escorts, no witnesses positioned to communicate the weight of communal concern. The absence of the apparatus he had brought the first time was itself a form of concession, though he would not have called it that. He stood at the entrance to the cellar in the brilliant post-storm light, looking at the snow-covered hillside at the vertical exhaust pipe, standing clean above the snowline, at the small entrance framed by hawthorn canes that had been bent and battered by the blizzard, and had sprung back into roughly their original positions when it ended, because hawthorn is the kind of plant that bends rather than breaks. Clara was washing her single pot in a basin of snowmelt. She dried her hands and turned to face him. Vane looked at the warm earthen walls, at the barely glowing stove, at the stovepipe going into the floor. He looked at all of it for a while before he spoke, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of the resonant pastoral authority it usually carried, as though the instrument had been slightly retuned by the past 4 days. "It seems Providence had a plan for you after all, Mrs. Whitfield. Perhaps the Lord placed this trial before you to reveal a wisdom that this community needed." Clara understood precisely what he was doing. She had understood it before he arrived. He was a man who had built his authority on the premise that he stood between his congregation and uncertainty, and a woman with clay on her hands who had survived a blizzard in a hole in the ground while his congregation nearly froze in their sound. Log houses was a direct challenge to that premise. The only available response for a man in his position was to absorb her achievement into his narrative, to make it evidence of God's plan, to make himself the narrator of her story, the person who recognized its meaning and explained it to others. If it was God's plan, then his opposition had been part of the plan. His doubts had been the trial that tested her resolve. He was not wrong to have questioned her. He had been an instrument. Clara raised her hands. The palms were calloused and scarred, the knuckles swollen, the fingernails cracked and stained with clay, that no amount of washing had fully removed clay that had worked its way into the lines of her hands and become part of their texture. God didn't dig this reverend vein, no, she said. Griffith designed it. I dug it with these. Vane looked at her hands. He looked at them for a long time. Then he looked at the warm walls, at the stovepipe in the floor, at the single candle and the journal on the table, and the narrow bed where Clem Dunmore had slept off a fever that might otherwise have taken him. He opened his mouth. He searched his considerable vocabulary for something adequate. He found nothing that would serve. He closed his mouth. "I'm glad you're alive, Mrs. Whitfield," he said finally. It was not an apology. It did not approach the shape of one, but it was the furthest distance that Aldous Vane had ever traveled in the direction of an apology. And Clara received it for what it was. Not absolution. Not satisfaction. A door cracked open by a fraction of an inch, by a man who had spent his life making sure all the doors opened inward toward him. She nodded. He left. He never climbed that hill again. Caleb Marsh was sweeping the workshop floor when Ezra came in. He had been doing unnecessary sweeping for 2 days. The floor did not require sweeping. He was sweeping it because the sweeping gave his hands something to do while he waited for the conversation that was coming. And the waiting was easier with something in his hands. Ezra stood in the doorway for a moment and watched him sweep. "You went behind my back," Ezra said. "Yes, sir." "You helped her build that flue." "Yes, sir." "You told my wife and not me." "Yes, sir." The silence stretched long enough to contain several different versions of what came next. Caleb kept sweeping not because the floor needed it, but because he was not yet sure which version was arriving, and he preferred to be moving when he found out. "I taught you how to build houses for 2 years," Ezra said. "She taught you something more important in 2 hours." Caleb stopped sweeping. "I should have listened when you asked me about Harrison's cold house. The problem was never the walls." The workshop was very quiet. Ezra extended his hand. Caleb looked at it. Then he set the broom against the workbench and shook it. The handshake was firm and brief and contained more than either of them was equipped to say out loud, which is what a handshake is for. "We're building something in the spring," Ezra said. "I'll need your hands." "Yes, sir," Caleb said. That was the entirety of it. There was no prolonged reckoning, no elaborate reconstruction of what had happened and why and who bore what portion of the responsibility. 2 men who built things for a living had found the most efficient structure available for a necessary conversation and had used it. Sometimes the simplest joint is the strongest one. Spring came to the Black Hills with the careful tentativeness it always brings to places that winter has recently finished with. Ezra Dunmore began the first community cellar in April, on a south-facing slope at the edge of Prospect, built into the hillside for a family whose cabin had been destroyed in the blizzard. He designed the above-ground structure himself. The entry, the door, the timber framing the small south-facing window positioned to capture the low winter sun. He built it with the same precision and solidity that had always defined his work, wide oak and tight joints and careful chinking, because 30 years of hard-won knowledge was still 30 years of hard-won knowledge. The underground portion was Clara's. She designed the flue channel from the dimensions of the cellar space, calculating the stone requirements and the clay mixture and the angle of the exhaust pipe, with the quiet confidence of a woman who had built this system once, in conditions of extreme difficulty, and understood it now from the inside out. She answered questions when asked. She showed the crew how to read the soil for the permafrost boundary, and why the capstones needed to be pressed into a mortar bed and allowed to freeze before the system was charged. The men who 6 months ago had called her project a folly followed her instructions with the careful attention of people who had recently learned the precise cost of certainty. The two designs, Ezra's and Clara's above-ground solidity and underground intelligence, met in the finished structure as naturally as two rivers meeting, each moving in its own direction, until the junction where they became something larger than either had been alone. Dorothea Voss came to watch the construction one afternoon and stood at the edge of the site, with her arms folded, and the thin, satisfied expression of a woman whose faith in a person has been publicly confirmed. "Strange world," she said to a neighbor standing beside her. "Last autumn, the whole town wanted to bury that woman. This spring, the whole town is digging dirt on her say-so." The neighbor laughed a little uncomfortably. "I'm not joking," Dorothea said. She was not. What came to be called the Welsh method spread across that corner of Dakota territory over the following decade, with the organic momentum of things that work. Families who had nearly lost children in the school children's blizzard told other families about the warm walls of an earthen cellar on a hillside outside Prospect. Caleb Marsh moved 60 miles west and built the first standalone Welsh method home in that county, writing to Clara once a year with updates on his projects and his growing understanding of principles that were still revealing new dimensions the more he worked with them. Ezra presented the method at a territorial building conference in the spring of 1889, standing before an audience of skeptical architects and contractors, with his hands in his coat pockets, telling the story honestly, including the parts that showed him at his worst, because he had come to believe that the honest telling of a failure was more valuable to the people listening than any polished presentation of success. Clara did not attend the conference. She stayed in her cellar on the hill, reading and thinking and receiving, with the unhurried attention of a woman who has arranged her life exactly as she intends it. The occasional visitor who climbed up to ask her something specific. She answered questions. She looked at drawings. She thought carefully about problems presented to her, and responded with the kind of answer that came from having built something with her own hands in difficult conditions. The kind of answer that knew the difference between what the diagram said and what the earth actually did. She turned away no one who came with a genuine question. She turned away several people who came looking for a story to tell about her. The distinction was clear to her, and she maintained it without apology. Clem Dunmore grew up in the valley. He grew up knowing the story of the blizzard, the way children know the stories that happened when they were too young to remember through the accumulating weight of details gathered across years from different sources, each version adding a new angle until the whole thing had the texture of something lived rather than told. He knew his father had carried him through a storm at 35 below. He knew a woman had opened a door and warm air had come out. He knew that his father had pressed his hand against an earthen wall and had not been the same man afterward. He became a builder, not immediately and not without other attempts at other things, but eventually and decisively, because the knowledge that there was a way of building that understood the earth as a partner rather than a problem to be solved. became the animating principle of everything he wanted to do with his hands. He specialized in the hybrid design above-ground timber and stone, married to below-ground intelligence that his father and Clara had developed together in the spring after the blizzard. He pushed it further, incorporating south-facing glass for passive solar capture, integrating the thermal mass principles into the foundations of structures that looked from the outside like conventional homes, but that breathed from the inside with the steady warmth of the earth itself. In the summer of his 22nd year, he built his first home entirely of his own design. A stone and timber structure set into a south-facing hillside in western Montana, belonging to a family that had spent years fighting their winters with brute force and losing. He stood in front of it when it was finished and had a photograph taken by a traveling daguerreotypist who happened to be passing through. He sent the photograph to Clara with a letter. The letter was short. He had learned from watching his father that the important things did not require many words, that the most durable joints were the simple ones, that what was built to last was built without excess. He wrote, "For Mrs. Whitfield, who taught me that walls can hold warmth." Clara received the envelope on a Tuesday in October. She read the letter twice. She looked at the photograph for a long time. A young man she remembered as a feverish child in a blanket standing in front of a handsome hillside home with his hands in his pockets, and the particular ease of someone who has done something they are quietly proud of. She pinned the photograph to the earthen wall of the cellar beside the shelf where Griffith's journal lived. She looked at it often in the years that followed. On the last evening of her life, Clara Whitfield sat at her small table as the November dark came down over the Black Hills. She had been in the cellar for nearly 20 years, not always continuously, not without the occasional winter spent in the proper hybrid structure that Ezra had built for her on the hillside in 1892, not without the slow expansion of her life beyond the immediate requirements of survival that the success of the Welsh method had gradually made possible. But the cellar had always been home, the place where the work had been done and the understanding had been earned. The stove held its small fire. The walls held their warmth. The single candle on the table threw its familiar circle of yellow light across the surface of Griffith's journal, open to the last page, the page she returned to the way water returns to its level. His handwriting trembled on the paper. The letters of a man whose hand had lost its argument with gravity, writing from the place where a person goes when they are spending their last careful reserves. The mountain does not fight the winter. It does not rage against the cold. It simply holds the memory of the sun deep within its stone, and it waits. The waiting is not passive. The waiting is the work. To hold what was given to you in the season of abundance and to release it slowly in the measured and patient language of stone, when the dark comes and the cold comes and the world outside forgets that warmth was ever possible. That is not endurance. That is intelligence. Clara closed the journal. She placed her hand flat on its cover. The leather was soft, worn thin by 2 pairs of hands across 3 decades. By the calloused hands of a man who had worked underground his whole life and had understood the earth from the inside. By the scarred, clay-stained hands of a woman who had taken what he knew and had dug it into the world with her own body. The warmth came through the walls the same way it always had, steady, even, sourceless in the way that all deep things are sourceless, coming not from any single point, but from the accumulated memory of a system that had been faithfully charged and faithfully released across years beyond counting. The smoke had paid its rent. The earth had kept its promise, and the warmth that had been coaxed from a hillside on a desperate December morning had traveled further than she would ever know. Through the hands of Caleb Marsh and Ezra Dunmore and Clem Dunmore and the builders they had taught, and the builders those builders had taught, through the walls of homes where children slept through the worst winters the northern plains could manufacture, through the long, slow chain of knowledge passed from hand to hand and wall to wall and generation to generation. Not a monument, not a plaque or a name in a history book. Something warmer and more durable than any of those things. She had begun with a hole in the ground and a dead man's journal, and the knowledge that the earth was not an enemy to be defeated, but a partner to be listened to. She had listened. The earth had answered. Outside, the November wind moved through the pine branches with the sound of something breathing. Inside, in the warm and quiet dark, Clara Whitfield set her hand against the wall one last time and felt the summer the stone had been keeping all this while, and was not afraid of the cold.